Chair, you are live.
Good morning. We're calling the Audit Committee to order. First order on the agenda is roll call. I think we have two members missing, Jim Cardillo, and at this moment, Alderwoman Tierney. Other than that, I think everyone is present and accounted for. First item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. I assume you all have the latest version. If you do, can someone please make a motion?
You froze a bit there, Ross.
All right, I'm accepting a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
I'm accepting a second for the agenda.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
First item on the agenda is approval of the minutes. Thank you for these, Kim. The minutes for the May 16th meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to the minute, or can I have a motion to accept them as submitted?
So moved.
Thank you. Good morning, Ellie.
Good morning.
Second.
All right. All in favor of approving the minutes signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
I guess we had all the ayes. Any nays? The minutes are approved. We move to old business now, and the first item on old business is a presentation from Sean Walker from CLIA. First, Sean, can you tell me, others might know, what CLIA stands for?
Well, actually, I never heard it referred to as CLIA, but I like it. It's CLA, stands for Clifton Larson Allen.
Thank you. And I understand you have an overhead presentation to give us?
Yeah, I'm going to share that right now. That'd be okay. Confirmation, all can see?
Yes.
All right, very good. So, so first of all, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity, as always, to provide these services to the city of Annapolis. We're here in front of you to present the audit results of the June 30, 2021. First thing is a team of professionals. I, Sean Walker, am the engagement principal that signs off on the audit opinion for the city. Bill Early did our quality assurance review. He's the second partner on the job that to make sure that we do it right and make sure we do it at a high level of quality. And Justin Measley is the manager that guides the work and make sure the project gets done along the way. And we also had a couple staff folks that actually work on the engagement as well. So, but what I'm going to talk about today a little bit is about the scope, go over some required communications with the audit committee, present the audit results, spend a minute or two just talking about upcoming GASBs that are going to be the challenge for future years, and then I'll stand for any questions. So first off, our audit scope is to audit the city's June 30, 2021 financial statements. We also do a review of the Uniform Financial Report, which is your state report that is submitted to the state. And we also do the single audit, which includes the audit of the schedule of federal awards and also a data collection form that will be submitted. The deliverables that you will have from us is you have two of these so far, three of them so far. There is another one that will be coming towards the end of the month that is dealing with the single audit, but I'm pretty confident in the results of that, so I'll share that today. The independent audit report, we did issue an opinion on the financial statements, and it was a clean opinion, the highest level. It's called an unmodified opinion. It's the highest level of assurance that we can actually, sorry for the vacuum all of a sudden. It's the highest level of assurance that we can provide on a financial statement. The second one is a report on internal control over financial reporting and compliance and other matters. In the financial statement, that's what we call it, the government audit. sorry about this. I happen to be in an uncontrollable environment, I guess. But anyway, the report of internal control for financial reporting compliance and other matters, which we call the Yellow Book report, we did issue that. We did cite one comment in there, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the report for the single audit, which is a report on compliance for each major program and internal control over compliance. And I'll talk about the results of that. As of right now, we do not have a finding in our single audit, which is quite a testament for the care that has been taken, especially with all the new grant funding. And then we have a governance letter, which I'll go over the highlights in a moment. So first, some of the required communications. It's our responsibility as your auditors to provide an audit opinion on your financial statement to make sure they're free from material misstatement. It is management's responsibility to prepare the financial statements. Just making sure that everybody's aware of that. That at times there's estimates that are used in the financial statements to help prepare them. Those have been outlined and detailed in the letter that was provided. And then obviously our role is to evaluate the overall financial presentation to make sure it conforms with professional standards. Like I said, we did issue an unmodified or clean opinion, which is the highest level of assurance that we can provide. The significant accounting policies are disclosed in the first note of your financial statements. And we evaluate them to make sure they're in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles and consistent with industry practices. Some of the significant disclosures are around your deposits, investments, your long-term liabilities, and fund balance designations and such. A few of the significant estimates that are in your financial statements, just to draw your attention to them, is the Opeb liability and the related amounts with some deferred inflows and outflows. Your Opeb liability is other post-employment benefits. Those are the health benefits that are that you provide for your retirees. So that's an actuarially determined liability. It's an estimate. You also have an incurred but not reported claims liability. That is an estimate. That's your claims, the estimate for the claims that happened, but you're not aware of it yet. And use historical information to determine that. The useful life of your capital assets and also the pension liabilities. Again, an actuarially determined liability. And obviously it's an estimate based on actuarial sciences. And we look at all those to make sure that they are reasonable and that they are within professional standards. And we do look at the basis for calculating them. And we felt like that they're all reasonably presented in your financial statements. All other misstatements detected as a result of the audit were attached to our governance letter. There was a couple entries that we passed on that were immaterial that were attached to that governance letter that we provided. There's no disagreement with management regarding accounting, reporting, or any other matters. We didn't have any difficulties during the audit. I mean, the completion of the audit was delayed again due to COVID-19. There's a lot of demands on the finance department, as well as, just in the profession with staffing and et cetera, that can create some delays. A matter of fact, many of the deadlines have been extended for the last 2 years just because of the fact of that the COVID-19 has put challenges on everybody. There was no issues discussed prior to the retention of us as auditors with other auditors. There was no consultations with other independent auditors, and there was no other findings that we found as part of the financial audit, other than the one that I'll talk about in a moment. We didn't provide a management letter this year. And then management representation letter, management did provide us with a signed representation letter prior to us issuing the financial statements. And that should be attached to your required communications that I sent to you. The internal control matters. Obviously, we do look at internal controls as part of expressing an opinion on the financial statements. We do not do an audit of internal controls, meaning that we don't provide what you would be familiar with if you're in the private sector, a SOC report or SOX type audit where we start issuing an opinion on financial statements, but we do look at the internal controls. We do look at internal controls from a standpoint of how do we support our opinion. And as we look at those internal controls, if we identify weaknesses in internal controls, we'll report those to you. And the way that we report those to you is one is a material weakness or significant deficiency. A material weakness is I guess the more severe of the two categories of finding. We did not report a material weakness on the financial statements, on the internal controls of the preparation of the financial statements. One of the less significant is a significant deficiency. We did report one significant deficiency that was included in your the Yellow Book report, the report on internal controls. I have that on the next slide, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So the report on internal controls over financial reporting, we called the financial close adjustments. As part of our process and part of management's process, management identified 4 adjustments to the current year's government-wide financial statements based on prior year activity. So what is that? That's basically, as they were closing the books this year, management did identify that there was things in the prior year that maybe weren't caught, and we had to create adjustments for them in the current year. And part of that, this is actually kind of if there's a good news finding and a finding, this is a good news finding. Obviously with Jody bringing on Julie and having the double set of eyes, I think we've talked about that for a couple of years, about getting someone like Julie in, is that with the new person looking at the processes and the review processes now with Jody, there were a couple of things that were identified that we adjusted in the current year financial statement. So you'll see here, my recommendation here is that we recommend the manager continue to review financial enclosure entries under the improved process that was implemented this year. This is a finding that I think will erase itself in the subsequent year. I think it's a case of things being right-sized in the finance department to be able to process the stuff, process the transactions timely and with an effective review process. Single audit status, like I said, we're looking to try to get this out by the end of the month. I think we have everything we need from the city at this point. And it's a matter of us just closing down our review process and issuing it. We did audit 3 programs this year. They were all COVID-related programs: the Federal Transit Formula Grant, the Corona Relief Fund, and the Corona State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. You'll see on the slide, I have the dollar amounts of those programs. The city has had a single audit in the last few years, so you still qualify as a low-risk auditee because you didn't have any major findings in the prior years. We're required to audit 20% of your 20% of the dollars of your federal programs, and this year we get 71%. And part of that is because these COVID relief funds were designated as a higher risk by the federal government, which required us to test them because they didn't on almost an annual basis. So it made us test more of the federal funds this year than we normally would. Again, expected issuance is June 30th. The normal deadline for single audits is 3/31, but there was an extension to the regulatory due date to September 30th due to the pandemic. And I think, and I did say this already, is that it is expected that you will have no findings in the single audit, which is a little bit of a good testament given the fact that a lot of this COVID money came out with confusing, complicated question guidance. The city took a nice approach to ensure that they were compliant with the spending of these funds. I guess, well, just real quickly on the GASB update. This upcoming year, one of the bigger challenges in the implementation, and I'm sure Jody may have mentioned it, or if she hasn't, she will be mentioning it, is the leasing standard. This is one of those standards that required all your operating lease and lease-like agreements to go through a determination to become what we would normally call capital leases back in the old days of accounting. But what that does is we'll put there's a financial effect on your balance sheet for your operating leases. And so the big trick is having to identify all those, do the calculation, which, the present value of the future cash flows of all these leases and put those on the financial statements. It's a big accounting exercise. So I know that that's going to be a challenge on the department this upcoming year. GASB Statement 96 was subscription-based information technology, and this is getting to, it's the sister to the lease standard, but it's not for another year. Some people are implementing them at the same time, but this is a multi-year software package agreement in which there's a tangible right to use asset associated with it. So I don't know how most of the clients that I work with don't really have a big impact here because their software agreements are an annual subscription, and so that would kind of kick them out. It's usually if you have a complicated, larger system, and Jody can tell us if she thinks she has something in that area. And then on GASB number 94, public-private, public-public partnerships. I think one of the challenges here is, and I know municipalities like to get into a lot of what they would call a P3 arrangements. So this standard, and I haven't dug into it completely to be able to figure out if you have anything that's existing, but just know when we enter into P3s in the future that there is a determination of what that's going to do from an accounting standpoint. So I put those out there as some of the upcoming issues. And I guess with that, I would like to stand for any questions that anyone may have.
So thank you, Mr. Walker. First question I have is, can we get a copy of your PowerPoint slides?
Yes, I sent them to several people.
Okay.
I
Could have even sent them to me, but I didn't see the emails.
No, I didn't. I sent it to, I think, Madeline.
Jim Moronsky will send that around to the committee.
Great. Thank you. I have some questions, but I'll defer to committee members to go first. Alderwoman Tierney.
Yeah, hi, good morning. Good morning. Just sort of ran not in order of priority here. This is to Director Dickinson. Did we ever, in any previous budget, itemize our lease agreements or any?
To date, there's been a requirement to evaluate your leases and call the larger, more long-term leases, capital leases. The only ones that we have right now that are legally capital leases are the automobiles that we bought and other heavy equipment that we bought through our equipment lease. I think legally that's a capital lease arrangement, even though we own the vehicles, but we have pledged them as collateral on the loan. And right now, that's all we have on the capital leases. What this does, and we are prepared, during the year, we purchased a product called Debt Book. And one of the reasons was they have a module that helps us track all of our debt that's outstanding, our debt issues. And we have previously relied on our financial advisors to help us track what's left in each issue. But we are now switching over and doing it internally. And one of the reasons this product was very attractive is because they also have a module that's going to help us implement this lease standard. And one of the things they offer is we accumulate and upload all of our lease agreements. And they do a preliminary review of all those agreements to see whether or not they meet the criteria in the new GASB standard. And then they provide us a list of what they've found. And then we have to go back and review what they have found to make sure we agree, because it's management's responsibility to make sure they're including the right leases. And I think that Julie may be able to update you more on where we're at there. I know they gave us their evaluation of our leases, and I don't know how many have been categorized as capital leases so far, but we have the responsibility, Julie and I, going over those and making sure we agree with their findings. Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, so we're meeting with them. They've uploaded all our leases. We're going through them. We're getting them our GL data right now. So we should be there by the end of the month, ready to go. And Piju and I have been working real hard trying to make sure we're catching all our capital leases. At the end of the day, it's not as many as we thought it was going to be. I'd say we're in the dozen to somewhere between 12 and 15 actual capital leases based on all the rules.
And what happens there is on, in the enterprise funds then, and in the citywide funds where we go full accrual, we have to put these on as liabilities, just like we do the pension liability and the Opeb liability. And so there's going to be an initial statement increase on the liability side, and you'll see that on the full accrual statements.
So that's how they'll be addressed in the budget.
So it's not necessarily a budget issue. For budget purposes, we're just tracking spending.
Yeah,
So in the budget side, you're going to see the payments going out
yeah,
for the leases being budgeted. This is
Right.
on the financial statement side. And I hope I explained that effect on the financial statements properly, that they don't want to show on the modified accrual statements that we have, just the full accrual, the roll-up statements and the enterprise funds, any that relate to the enterprise funds.
yeah. Early in the budget review, I looked up I looked up other city budgets, and I know I think it triggered a question from me, I think to City Manager Jarrell on why we don't itemize our leases. I think it was either Asheville or Charleston that did it in an executive summary in the budget. But so my second question,
We can do that now because we have this software. We've got all of our leases, whether they're operating or capital, in one database. So we hopefully, if you want that in the future, we can just extract that information from the software.
Oh, that's great. I think that's great because we need to know that. What does it mean? What's involved in quote? This is for Mr. Walker. What is involved in testing major programs?
So, so when we test a major program, basically, we take the expenditures of the federal government or the federal expenditures, which you guys actually spend. We categorize it based on salaries, general disbursement, capital, or whatever the various expenditure patterns are. And we basically will select samples in each of those categories to test. It also involves looking at the reporting that is required to the federal government on that, or to one of the county or whoever gave you the money. Look at the reporting. If there's eligibility requirements, we'll look at if the people receiving the money is an eligible person or eligible entity, whether it's an eligible cost. So it kind of steers based on how you spend the money. So what we end up doing is testing the transactions to ensure that they're in compliance with the grants. I don't know if I explained that enough.
Yeah, you did. I mean, in accounting word, I hear these different terms like stress test and et cetera. So I was just curious on what the application of the word testing was in this context.
No, it's actually sampling and looking at underlying expenditures.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are there other questions from the committee? I'm looking at GADSB 96 since we may or may not be entering into a big 3P. I guess we'll hear about that a little bit later, but is that kind of accounting fairly onerous? The GADSB requirements?
Well, I don't know, Jody, if you looked at it yet, but I don't feel like it's onerous. It's the standard was actually released because there's so many governments getting into these arrangements, and there's complications in all the agreements. All the governments have different little clauses and terms, and so what it's doing prior to that, it was all of really a high level judgment based on how you would record it, trying to find what the financial substance of the transaction is and record it. So they really just needed a standard to help us navigate how to record it consistently across the government communities. So there's a lot of nuance in it. I would say it's not difficult, but it's like if this and this exists, then you're going to have a liability and an asset. If this and this exists, you won't. And I will be honest, I haven't dug in enough. I need to sit with a P3 and kind of work it through the standard to really get a good contextual understanding of it. But I know that it's out there. The only reason I threw it out there for you guys is that it is a standard that will affect a lot of the municipalities that are doing this kind of P3, because there's a lot of interest in municipalities level, the cities, and doing a lot of P3 to help finance projects. And that's what this is getting to. I don't know, Jody, if you have anything that you know
No,
of.
just the existing standards, they're not easy, we're working on we were working on a concession agreement. So depending on the terms of the concession agreement, you have to compare that to the decision tree, I'll call it, that's in the existing standard to figure out how you record what the arrangement is doing, who owns the property, what you're paying over how much time, that kind of thing. And this new standard, I haven't looked at it yet to see how that's going to change, and it'll all depend on how this agreement comes out at the end, but we are working on one right now. May or may not end up to be a P3. We'll have to see where we're at the end.
I think the real strength in it is that when you go through that agreement is involving finance to go through and assess the transaction, so you know what the paper impact, the fiscal impact, the economic impact to the financial statements will be. Sometimes those deals are, they're handled on a different side of the house outside of a finance department. I see that every once in a while, and then it's just to make sure the finance is at the table so that they can make sure the clauses and agreements that everybody understands the financial impact.
All right, are there other questions from the committee? If not, thank you, Mr. Walker, for that fine, clear presentation. And I think congratulations are in order to our finance director and staff that we came through so cleanly. So thank you, Jody and Julie and everybody else who put their shoulder to the wheel. We appreciate that.
Yep. Thank you all.
Thank you. Okay, next item on the agenda. Yes, Director Dickinson.
Is there anything that you want me to stay for? As I've said later on, that Julie's going to take over and do the other discussion at the end of the agenda. Is there
So
something?
Julie will do the closed session.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now get back to your ethics.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Because I had to miss it last week for a fact meeting, so I don't want to miss my ethics training again. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right. So next item on the agenda is the fraud hotline. I want to again take a moment to thank, at least for me, this body of work that Jim Cardillo put together for us and was forwarded to all of you. And the fraud hotline is part of that. I remember there was a lot of excitement about it when we first initiated it, but I have to say I have no idea how many fraud hotline reports we've gotten. I know there was an interesting one initially from one of my constituents, but I haven't heard much. So I don't, David, is that something that you would talk to us about?
It is, yeah. So good morning.
Good morning.
So we have an annual contract with a company called Lighthouse Services, and we have for, I guess, about 3 years since this fraud hotline was established. So they operate, they take the calls. During my, the mayor's calling. During my 30 months in this job, have not received a single hotline complaint. But Lighthouse Services provides a quarterly report letting us know how many calls that they have received, which has been 0. If they would have, then they would reach out to me, and then I would pass the information on to the chair of the audit committee if any calls were received, and we would then take appropriate action. But fortunately for us, we haven't had to do that. The other thing that I've done, and I think Teresa Sutherland did, is each year, and usually it's in July, so I'm planning to do that this coming July, is to let all of the employees know that we do have a fraud hotline, what number they should call, and sort of what the process is if they want to report anything. Just to refresh everybody's memory that we do have this in place and it's available to them. So I'll send that out. It's just sort of a standard email that I've sent out the last couple of years and we'll send out next month.
So for the committee members that have been on from the beginning, and I was not, what was the impetus for doing this? Was there a thought that there was fraud lurking about and we weren't catching it? And the second side of that question is, since it appears that either we're not adequately letting people know about the fraud line or that there isn't much fraud and abuse going on, how are we thinking about the future of this in terms of committee work? It doesn't seem to be a big level of effort, to be honest, but so when it was first initiated, why did we think we needed that? I don't know who, David, were you? Alderman Pendle
Yeah,
Charles.
Teresa Sutherland was still here when it was implemented.
Yeah,
I
right.
think that there was a couple reasons. One is there was a thought that maybe there was some fraud, waste, and abuse lurking out there that would be reported. And it's just a good, I mean, I think it's a best practice to have in place that you have a fraud outline in case there are instances that gives people an avenue to anonymously report any of the fraud, waste, and abuse that may be going on.
Do we pay Lighthouse a flat fee, or do we pay them by fraud hotline calls?
We pay them a flat fee, a flat annual fee.
And can you tell me how much that is?
I can look it up. If you
Well,
want to
just
continue, I'll get back to you.
Yeah,
I
all right.
don't know if
Thank
I
you.
don't. It's not a lot of money, I can tell you that, but I don't know what it is off the top of my head.
All right. Are there comments or questions from, yes, Alderwoman Pendle Charles?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to quote Winfred Brimley. It's the right thing to do.
Okay. Thank God it wasn't Mr. Whipple. Mr. Malinoff.
Thanks. To sort of build on what David and Alderwoman Pendle Charles said, in the two previous communities that I worked in, and we set up an internal affairs office, it was part of the practice to allow for anonymous reporting. And so David is right, it is a best practice that I've seen too.
All right. Is there any other discussion on this? Yes, Director, the City Manager, Daryl. Soon to be Director.
The annual cost is $782.60.
Can we tack it on to the hospitality? All right. Are there any other questions or comments from the committee on this topic? Then moving on to the historic perspective for the audit committee. This is something that Jim and I volunteered to work on together, and he put together the document that you received. The reason that I asked for this is trying to get a sense of where the audit committee has been and where it might go in the future. We did a recent, 2 years ago now, amendment to the duties to the audit committee. I want to make sure that we are, and I hope we all are on board, that we want to make us doing productive things and not doing just busy work and creating another meeting for the finance director and the city manager to come to. Jim was going to lead this discussion. He is rightfully so taking a vacation. So I would submit, unless there's some comments now, we leave this on the agenda for the next meeting when he is here. Are there questions, comments? All right, moving on to the strategic plan, my favorite document. And I have an immediate question for where we are. There seemed to be a debate about how much money was available to do the revisit and possible revision of the 2012 strategic plan. I believe 50,000 was earmarked for this. And then Alderwoman Tierney, as chair of the Finance Committee, you were also talking about carryover money from the survey that was passed in the citizen survey that was passed by the Finance Committee of a year ago, which is another $50,000. I guess my immediate concern is I would like to get moving on this. I will give you my notion of why this is important and open up comments from you, but it seems strange to be a city of now $175 million thereabouts budget without having a formal strategic plan, which in it includes mission and vision statements and goals and objectives. And it does seem to me that that strategic plan is sort of the overhanging support for then each of the department's performance management systems, and under that, each of the employees' performance appraisals. So there's a nice vertical hierarchy there. And my vision is that when we get a revised strategic plan, that the mission, vision statement, and the strategic goals will be plasticized and put on our desks as a reminder, not only to us as council members about what our plan is, but also a reminder to all the other boards and commissions that sit at our chairs and adjudicate the city's business. It also seems to me in my grand scheme, and this is up for test, that with a strategic plan and a comprehensive plan, we now have some really strong guideposts for how we plan to proceed over the next several years. And it should be a touchstone, I believe, for all of us when we're proposing new legislation. For example, how does this foster our strategic plan, or how does this meet our comprehensive plan? That expression I first heard when I was in the Air Force is plan your work and work your plan. This seems like a very good thing to do. In our particular work, the work that Mr. Malinoff led back in 2011-12, we also did a citizens survey. And I like it because it was the ICMA community survey, which is an annual survey, and it can have a core set of questions and then some variable questions, but it also is the same set of questions that are asked of some 500 different municipalities. So we have a good comparator. How are we looking versus our peers? I'll say one last thing, and I did then want to invite Mike to tell me where I've led us astray or embellish what I've said. I was at Maryland Municipal League meeting, and I was struck by 157 municipalities, and I happened to be at a budget forming class, and the people I sat with, no one of the other three communities were more than 150 people. But in fact, one of them was a community of only 15. But I asked them, did they have a strategic plan? Yes, we do. Now, I actually think we ought to start going to MACO rather than MML, because I think the issues for a city of our size are more akin to county level issues. But in any event, it's like, as Rhonda said earlier, it's just good practice. It's smart to do. But I will defer to Mr. Melinoff since he has the hands-on experience with this. But I want to leave open that question of where's the money and how quickly are we going to spend it? And should we be thinking about spending it with ICMA, or do we want to do a full procurement kind of thing? And Director Gerald, you had your hand up. I mean,
Yes.
City Manager Gerald.
You fall right back into that. I like that. So I just wanted to say, so that the money that we're talking about, that there's basically three sources of money. You remember that that last year we set up money for a community survey. That money is still available. It's being carried over. So that can be used as part of this whole strategic plan, because that is a necessary part of the strategic planning process. There was also money set aside for a task force to look at city services consolidating with the county. That has not been spent. So maybe that could be used. And then we also talked about some of the audit committee funding potentially being used, since we probably won't be hiring. This is probably a higher priority than hiring an outside audit firm to look at one of the departments. So those were the three sources that we kind of had in mind. We reached out to Forrest to ask what their approach would be to doing this work, since they did all of the performance measures, and they have given us that. I don't think that they gave us a price quote, but it seems pretty straightforward. We just need to decide, and Mike needs to decide if that's the approach we want to take, or if there's better approaches, because I know he's done more of these than I have. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you. And I'll work with David on the funding and better understand it over the next month or two. But I think, Ross, you hit the nail on the head that every community should have one. And it's a organic document that changes through time and new people involved and new priorities from the community. I'll note that Alderwoman Pindell Charles at times had mentioned that 10 years ago, there may be things different now than there were then. And to make this successful, we're going to have to engage everyone, including the Alderwoman, so that we make sure that the information and our strategic plan is relevant to today. What I would suggest along the lines of what David was saying is there are other resources available out there. I think that the National Citizen Survey is the state of the art and is really valuable. Alderman Arnett, you're right. It's not only does it survey what we think we are and how well we're doing, but it's a great comparative tool. And I also like, because when I was here before, I tinkered with using Anne Arundel County and forget the fellow's name, but they have a survey tool. And I also tried using OpinionWorks, which is a resident of West Annapolis. And it was difficult for both of them to do because of the nature of the surveys and getting a statistically significant response, which is difficult in this day and age because we all have cell phones. So National Citizen Survey knows how to do it and uses a whole variety of tools, including computers and our cell phones, and if we need to, landlines. In terms of who we use, I know David's talked to me a little bit about the entity that's been doing some of the work with Eric on the strategic plan. I'd like to investigate a couple of other possibilities before we jump in. I don't know whether the University of Maryland's doing it anymore. They were the ones that were doing it or leading it previously. And I liked what they did, but when I was in Charles County, which was 2018, we used another entity that was loosely affiliated with ICMA, and we did something called the Hpo model, which is high performing organization. And I think you all would really like it because it involves the staff in developing goals and objectives internally and create something called parallel work groups. So you don't have silos, just public safety people doing public safety and so on. And these parallel work groups will be made up of cross disciplines to work on the areas that we all think are important. And obviously would involve the council, the community, and others. So I'm going to look at that a little bit, see where they are, because like mentioned earlier, the pandemic has made a lot of changes in the world, and then come back to you all in say early fall with some ideas.
Yeah. I hope
Early fall.
I hope we can do this quickly. I think
I'm going to be gone in July, mostly because of a previously scheduled vacation, but I'm going to be back in August, and August is kind of quiet. So I'm going to jump into it in August. So by early fall, I mean, late August, early September timeframe.
But I will get to you in 1 second, Alderwoman Tierney, but I just think this is such a strong underpinning for our budgetary process, certainly linking the performance measures by the departments to a strategic plan. And they probably really pretty much are still well linked to this strategic plan. I don't know how much revision. I personally think we might want to have a couple more goals, broad-based goals, but the budget process really starts in late fall. And I would really very much like to see this be a guidance, but the two things, the community survey and the task force, were also meant to help guide our budget process. So I personally feel some urgency now, thanks to a Saturday morning conversation with City Manager Gerald of a few weeks ago. I'm feeling fairly comfortable about fiscal 24 at this point, without some big unknown catastrophe headed our way. So it is not a right now we've got to do it, but we've been without it. And I also think that one of the good things about this is I bet some of the most discussion is going to be amongst council members about the wording of the mission and vision statement. And that's an exercise I think that we really need to get on. I think it's something that can lead to much more of a shared vision rather than 9 autonomous political entities that every once in a while collide and coalesce and then bounce away and form again in different groups. So I think from a management and for the health of the planning the future of the city, this is, for me, and I'll leave it to committee members to comment, a very, very high priority. I also think that this looking at the county to see shared services, well, I don't know that there's really ever going to be any, but I would think that as we look out a few years when COVID money is gone and our expenses are growing faster than our revenue sources, that kind of thinking is something we want to have behind us and ready to go with, not sort of scrambling as we're pulling together the fiscal 25 budget. So I feel very strongly in this process. I feel I like very much this integration, and I think that it is both vertical and horizontal integration at all levels. And so it has a matrix management appeal to it as well for me. But I've spoken too much. Alderwoman Tierney, please.
Oh, no, thank you. Just a question and I guess a comment. The question is, we did a lot of work on performance measures and the departments did, valiant effort to report by the performance measures. So my question is, what did Forrest, who helped with these performance measures, did they look at the 2012 strategic plan? I mean, the performance measures have to go, towards a goal, which is, in a strategic plan. So I would think that they had looked at the 2012, which then would make sense for Forrest to do the strategic plan. So I don't want to lose that work.
Yeah.
So what they did, so you'll recall that we already had existing performance measures that weren't in great shape.
Right.
And that's why we felt like we needed to hire somebody to help with them. And so
Okay.
that's what they looked at. They didn't,
Okay.
I think they at least reviewed the 2012 strategic plan, but they mostly focused on those existing performance measures to try to improve them and to try to reduce the number somewhat, which is annoying.
Yeah. Did they ever in the course of discussion bring up the fact that they should lead to
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. It's a missing element. And then just as a comment, it was clearly demonstrated during the amendment review meeting, the all-day session, that we do need a strategic plan. We're all grabbing, for money, and if we had that strategic plan, to look at, I mean, we wouldn't be having this squabble about where the hotel tax money goes.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's
Or where Parks
definitely-
and Recs money goes and things
yeah,
like that.
yeah. And I'm glad you reiterated Alderman Arnett, because I didn't have time to explain to Alderwoman Finlayson that I did not want to take away the community survey. I wanted to make sure that it was part of the strategic
Right.
plan and the money stayed intact. So that's all good stuff. Thanks.
We haven't touched on it, but one of the good things that Mr. Melanoff did for us in 2012 was to create a dashboard. And that dashboard, to the extent that our citizens take advantage of it, is a huge communication vehicle. And I think it's a boon to us when we get questions from constituents. We can direct them to that dashboard, not only for their information edification, but also for their input, because it allows them to comment. It's one of the other promises that OpenGov has, which we haven't yet tapped, which is that you can have a module that allows citizens to go through their own budgeting exercise. So, okay, Mr. Kardash, not to take a friend's name in vain, how would you do the budget? What would you take money away from, and where would you put it? Or how would you lower the taxes and so forth? And so I think that the more we can engage in a productive and constructive way our citizenry, the more we're going to bring our elected, the people who elect us, back into the fold. Quite frankly, I think a lot of people have just tuned us out. And I think that we need to work on rebuilding, I'll just say the word, I won't use the word trust, but I will say reliance on the city government and the city electeds doing a good job, knowing what their citizens want, and balancing all of their desires with the realities of limited resources. So there's so much more that we can do here. I will just say editorially, yeah, Forrest may have improved the performance measures, but I think we have a long way to go. And I think that we need to pare it down. We need to get some real measures in there, things that we can look at and say, gee, it looks here like you didn't do as well on this measure as you did last year. What's happening? And that could be the opening for the department to say, well, you remember, we asked for an enhancement so we could do such and such. We didn't get it, and so we couldn't do that. And so that creates, I think, a much more healthy and much more fact-based dialogue going on between us and the departments when we're dealing with the budget. Right now, the budget is pretty much 99% cooked by the time the city manager and the finance director look at it. There is not a lot of latitude. And I think the only way we can be safe and sure and thinking about some meaningful change in the budget is to have some information and some input from our constituents. And that's what the citizen survey was intended to do. We'll see how well it can do it. And that's what that review of what could we do at the county level instead of the city level. I have to tell you, at MML, I said goodbye to Scott Hancock, who is retiring. And I asked him, why do we even have municipalities? It seems to me like there's a huge duplication of effort with all of this overhead infrastructure and so forth. And he said, because the municipalities were there before MML. It's a historical artifact, just like us. How many hundreds of years do we go back? But in terms of efficiencies, I'm not sure it's the most efficient way to do it. And he repeated the thing that I often hear when I talk about doing services with the county. No, we need to maintain control of our own resources to serve us. And I'm thinking, yeah, we have a lot of control, but let the illusion go on. Anyway, I guess my summary comment is, I will get to you, Alderwoman. Sooner rather than later would be my plea. I think this is an important step forward in this city catching up with a whole host of other peer municipalities, and it's just going to be good for us. So, yes, Alderwoman Pendle Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Several things I want to mention. I have just one question, but I'm overall, I'm all for a survey, as well as strategic plan. My concerns revolve around several things. We all know on the council that we have some very vocal residents that respond to pretty much everything and anything that comes along. But we have some wards and residents who we never hear from. Then we have some residents who only talk to their council person. And so my trepidation is, how do we adequately capture everyone that we need to capture? And I'll give you an example. Last week, and Mr. Gerald knows the person, but I won't mention names, who chastised me for not being, I guess, available for those who aren't computer savvy, those who only use a telephone, those who only complain to their neighbors, where it does not come through to a certain place. And that's what my concern is. We tend to kind of oftentimes, or too often, overlook the people that we need to hear from the most. And so that is extremely concerning to me. The vocal folks will make sure their voices are heard many times over. And we get those emails every day. There was one issue we had, and I noted, we had 82 responses. Now, maybe I get 82 responses, but they're not coming in the same way that those 82 responses come to all of us. And so that's really a lot of my concern with this survey. The other thing is life changes when it comes to a strategic plan. And I'll give you one example. And I've said it before, once we had the departments submit their budgets, we immediately saw an uptick and a spike in violence in our communities. And we recognized, at least as your public safety chair for the council, that there needed to be some redirection, that we needed to do something immediately. We couldn't wait for the bullets to keep flying, for children to be hurt, for people screaming and hollering about what's going on in the neighborhood. It was something that needed to be done immediately with Director Trader as well as the police chief. We could not wait for 8 or 9 people to sit in a room to determine what needs to be done. People wanted relief immediately. And so not only relief, but we needed to find some funding. And I talked to our city manager about that. He assured me that we could do that. And so my fear is that if that's not in a strategic plan, and if it's not considered that we've got people screaming and hollering about what we aren't doing, how does all that fit in? And I understand, Mr. Chair, you talk about shared vision, and that is a better way to couch it. But we have to recognize that we've got a city that's extremely diverse, a small city that's extremely diverse. And we need to take that into consideration. And oftentimes, too often, like I said, that gets lost in the shuffle. And
so if I could just
I'm not finished, but okay. No,
well, I want to validate your point. As a professional, I did national surveys, and they were in-person interviews, they were telephone interviews, but our problem always was trying to get to the people. Homeless was a big problem we had. People without a cell phone, or with a cell phone, actually. Landlines were our blessing, but many people shifted to it. So that's always a problem that a survey people need to do. But I mentioned belatedly the dashboard. Now, again, you have to be technically competent or have somebody who can help you be competent to that. But let's let Mr. Melanoff speak to
Okay.
this because he did it. And then we'll come back to your other point, please.
Okay, it's the squeaky wheel gets the grease, but yeah, okay, thank you.
I
Thank
can
you, Mr. Chair.
I can assure you, Alderwoman Pindell Charles, it won't just be Ward 8 people.
I didn't call any numbers.
Now, there'll be Ward 1 people too.
A
didn't
few
call
Ward
any
1
numbers.
and a lot of Ward 8. No, we'll make sure that's not the case.
Yeah.
Absolutely good points and valid. And again, one of the reasons I liked the National Citizen Survey is they know that is an issue in all communities. And one of the things I asked them when they were doing it, and I think it was last in Charles, so it was fairly recent, is that was a community that was really spread out. It was, I used to call it a large municipality because it was about 180, 200,000 people, but it was so spread out, it was hard to reach people. And it wasn't a really connected citizenry because they were all commuting to DC for work. But they used a variety of different tools. They would go into libraries, they would go into the communities, they would use cell phones, excuse me, and other means. But they'd also use algorithms to make sure that certain wards where people aren't necessarily as active, to make sure that the survey tool is balanced based on population and demographics in the different wards. So it does have a scientific side to it to make sure we're not overly skewed towards certain parts of the city where people are more active. Nothing's perfect, but they're pretty aware of it. And I'd be more than glad once I make contact with them to introduce you to them so you can feel comfortable yourself. And you'll see that they're pretty good at that. In terms of the strategic plan being flexible, of course, it has to be. It's an organic document that changes. Shouldn't change drastically all the time, but when something comes up like we've just been living, the pandemic, and if the strategic plan doesn't have anything in there, we need to make sure that we address the issues that come up, and it will do that. What I like the most about it is it really engages the workforce and the community in ways that we don't really normally see. And I think I shared with you all the vision that the Charles County employees published, and they have at at all the buildings. And it's continued post me being there, which was really kind of shows that it's enduring if it's done well. So that would be my hope. And I've learned since 10 years ago. So I think it'll be a even better document, and I'll work with all of you to make sure you share that. And Ross, one final comment about counties versus municipalities. I've worked in a couple of counties, and some are good and some aren't. So the big counties, you can get really, lost. And
Yeah.
there are a few people pulling all the strings, and you don't really know until you know. And David kind of experienced that in a big county called Baltimore City. So, it's all in how you run it.
So the last thing I would make, and then we'll get back to you, is I did a lot of work, I think it was after you left, Mike, on creating a set of core values, which I think needs to be also revisited and is something that we need to underpin. And I'll be honest, Rhonda, when I first did it, I shared it with Sheila, she said, where's diversity? Where is recognizing cultural differences? And so I went back and did a major revision, but I think that's another thing that we need to get back to. We all know it's there, but we don't really recognize it, and I think honor it. And I think we need to have a set of shared core values that are a touchstone that we do. So why are we doing this, and who gets left out when we don't adhere to our core values? So But you had another point?
Yeah. And concerning the looking at combining services with the county, I hearken to a saying, be careful what you ask for. Now, I'm all for listening to what our residents have to say about that. But I do feel as though those of us on the council have a greater insight into why we should or should not do certain things, combining services. And so I guess my question / comment is, what do we do when it comes back and says, yes, we should combine these services? We in the city, knowing full well that will not work. Do we just ignore the residents? Do we use a sledgehammer? What do we do? And so be careful what you ask for. That's kind of what I see that as. And a couple of other things.
Let's stop at that point, please.
Mhm.
You're absolutely right in using the word we, and in this case, there are only 9 we's. The elected officials are the ultimate and only policy makers. And you're right. We need to exercise our judgment and use our wisdom. It's very easy to have, a stampede to go in some direction, but we're elected in part to rely on our good sense and our set of moderation and caution. So you're absolutely right. We could get some things that could come out of that, but ultimately the 9 of us have to make that tough call. And good morning, Mr. City Attorney.
Morning. I've been here for a while.
I know. All right.
The other thing I want to piggyback on that, Mr. Chair, we all know, and it's no big secret, that when we get a deluge of residents who want something or don't want something, we're going to generally go in that direction. And so how are we able to look clearly at our own decision making, knowing that we've got a cast of thousands out there saying, do this or don't do this, when we know better? So we have to be very steadfast in our decision making when we know something is right or something is wrong. And so I would behoove all of us to keep that in mind. And the other thing is,
let me stop you there again.
Mhm.
I think you're absolutely right. And that's why having a recognized shared vision, but also when we have a new city manager, I'm going to propose again that we have a council retreat, because I think we're talking about things that go well beyond the audit committee, but do go towards us forming that shared vision and core values and all of those things. I think we have, and many people at MML agree, the toughest job to do, because we are part-time, essentially volunteered people that are representing 40,000 different points of view, plus all of the business. And we hear from visitors, particularly when they get a $300 parking ticket. But that goes well beyond the purview of the audit committee. But I do think it is something that we need to spend more time working on.
Absolutely. And the other thing to
Oh, go ahead.
Mr. Malinoff, did you want to respond?
No. It was just another point, more technical. So you finish and then I'll pipe up.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that the survey is going to come first and then the strategic plan, for the obvious reasons.
Chicken or the egg?
Don't we need to know what the public is saying before we start on a strategic plan? So I'm just going to lay it out there. Now, the other thing, and this is kind of not off topic because we talked about it, about the municipalities, and Mr. Lyles may disagree, but I'm going to say this in the most respectful way possible. And I'm going to speak from a cultural standpoint when it comes to municipalities and why I think Prince George's County has 30 some, 32, 38, whatever. And I'm going to come from a cultural standpoint, and this may be totally wrong, but this is how I see it. Culturally, African Americans have never really had control over anything but our churches, pretty much. And so I'm going to go out on a limb and say, when it comes to these small municipalities, there needs to be some level of authority when it comes to small jurisdictions, where we get to decide, and I'll use we in the collective sense, our own destination. And that's how I see why it is the way it is. And oftentimes when you try to answer a question, it's based historically. And so when we have an opportunity, just like when we had redistricting, I guess 20 or more years ago, it was strategically decided that we would have at least 3 African-American representatives on the council. That was done strategically. That was, and my husband served on that redistricting committee. So it's sometimes these things are based in culture. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Thank you, Alderwoman Pendle Charles. And I must say, I really understand and share the comments you're making. And I think they are things that we need to be legitimately concerned about and devoting our time. We are running long. Mr. Melanoff, did you have one more comment?
All I was going to say is with the performance measurements, and from what I could see from being an acting department director, it's really important as we go forward to create buy-in to make sure they're relevant and not just output measures. And I think that'll be part of our job too, because my experience was there wasn't a lot of people were working on it, but there wasn't a lot of strong attachment to what they were reporting.
I'd like to ask the city attorney a question at this point. We have a closed session on the agenda, and I believe it's to select the next audit firm. I note that we have no citizen members now present on the audit committee. I'm not even sure we have a quorum. So I guess the first question is, do we have a quorum? And then the question to the committee, do we want to, I'm assuming we're going to make a selection in the closed session. Do we want to do that without having a single citizen member of the committee? And then the final question, I guess, to the city manager is how urgent is making that selection? Is that we must do it today, or is that something that could be deferred for another meeting or even set up a special meeting? Question about quorum, question about the urgency to go into the closed session and make a selection.
Let me check on the quorum issue. I don't think it's an issue if you have a quorum that you don't have citizen members, because that's irrelevant to the quorum. But let me just check on the number real quick.
And I'll ask Judy or Julie to weigh in on the urgency to get somebody under contract on this.
It's actually pretty urgent. We need to get
Okay.
rolling on it with the end of the year coming up.
All right. Well, with that, pending hearing something to the contrary, as much as I really would like to get an update from the finance department, I think, yes, Mr. City Attorney.
No, sir, you don't have a quorum.
All right, well, that settles.
Just to be clear, I'm sorry. 3 council members, 3 citizen members, and at least one of those has to be a member of the Financial Advisory Commission.
So then I think that given the urgency just expressed by Ms. Donnelly, we may need to try to schedule a special meeting of the audit committee with a quorum so that we can get that selection made. I'll work with the finance department and the other appropriate authorities in the city to see when we can get on your schedules to have that special meeting, hopefully within the next week. Yes, Alderwoman Pendle Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to assume that means that Mr. Cardillo, being a member of FACT, must be at this meeting. Is that correct?
That is correct, given what.
Let me make it really clear. One of the members has to be from the Financial Advisory Commission. As I read it, you've got 3 citizen members. Of those 3, the one has to be from the Financial Advisory Commission. Now, does not mean that you cannot do business without one of those citizen members not being a member of the FACT. But one of the citizen members, one of the 3 has to be a member of the FACT.
And as
Thank you,
a
Mr. Lyles.
note in passing, I think we're down 2 members, 2 citizen members on the audit committee. So I already suggested silently to a couple of you who I might nominate. If you want to forestall that, I would ask you to recruit, rummage around. And of course, I would ask help from the city for matters just like this, electing the auditor. But I think matters like getting into the strategic plan and fraud, we really need to be up to a full complement of citizen members, and then possibly we wouldn't have the issue facing us now. So I think my sense of what I've heard is we cannot go into the closed session and take up the issue because we don't have the right quorum. And then I think we have also heard there's some urgency, so I'll work to see with your schedules and others when we can have a brief meeting of the audit committee to go into closed session and make the audit selection. With that, I would ask the committee, we also have on the agenda, an update from the finance director. Julie, can you give us a brief one, or maybe Mr. Gerald? I'm most anxious to hear where we are on the 3P, but I think there's other matters that we normally hear about.
Primarily, I think Jody wanted to talk about the selection of the audit firm. And so I think Mr. Darrell's probably a better one to speak to the P3 than I am. And I just had a quick question. Is it possible to present about, can we not go into closed session at all? I'm sorry if I have a misunderstanding of it. To present it so that the next time y'all meet, it could just be a quick vote, or is it really better not to discuss it at all?
I think I saw a negative nod from the city attorney, and I think I agree with him.
Okay.
The reason for the closed session is this is proprietary, presumably proprietary information, and it shouldn't be open to the public.
Okay.
We'll work on it. I understand the urgency. We'll get it taken care of. Mr. Gerald, any parting words that you want to share, or shall we
So
adjourn?
the demolition of Hillman Garage is moving along very well. And as far as the discussion of the P3 and the concession agreement, we're hoping to join. And I just sent an email to Mr. Lyles this morning to ask that we be allowed time on Thursday's city council closed session so we can provide an update on the project and on the financing and on the P3.
All right,
It's a
thank you.
closed session item.
Right. All right. Is there anything for the good of the order from the few remaining committee members? All right, Mr. Lyles.
Just to remind you, when you get a quorum, you can approve your minutes from the previous meeting. All votes and matters of business that required a vote would have to be done at the meeting where you have a quorum.
Thank you. We did have a quorum when we approved the last set of minutes, but you're correct. We will have to get a quorum to approve the next set. Any last words before I entertain a motion to adjourn? Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor